he has some great interviews, and he really holds these folks' feet to the fire. Here is Mehdi interviewing Anthony Fauci.
There's increasing pressure on the president, as you know, to ignore big pharma and temporarily waive patent protections on the COVID vaccine. 60 countries led by India and South Africa, 100 members of the US Congress, 100 Nobel laureates, multiple former world leaders. Your friend, Dr. Tedros, the head of the World Health Organization, they all say it's the right thing to do to help developing countries in particular. You seem to disagree, according to an interview you did with the FT yesterday. Why are they all wrong, Dr. Fauci?
No, they're not all wrong, and I don't necessarily disagree. I'm really quite agnostic on that. My approach is that the end game is where I want to go. I want to see people now in the developing countries getting vaccinated. However you do that as quickly as possible is fine with me. One of the complicating issues of the so-called waiving the patents is that by the time you then get set up to get the technology transferred to other countries to be able to do it, you may be going into the end of 2022, the beginning of 2023, at which point a lot of people will have died. So I'm not against transferring technology, and I'm agnostic about the TRIPS waiver. The one thing I am bullish on, and I really
Fauci,
do feel we need to do...
How can you be agnostic, though? How can you be agnostic? You're the chief medical advisor. If the president says, Dr. Fauci, what should I do? What's your advice? What are you going to tell him?
I'm telling get people vaccinated as quickly as you possibly can. If that means getting billions of doses from companies and getting it to the people in the low and middle income countries at a very, very low price that they can afford, do it and do it now. Because if you want to start transferring technology, you're going to get it to them a year and a half from now. So I can be agnostic about it. My only concern is I care about people getting vaccinated. However you do that, go for it and do it now.
Here, well, let me just, I mean, obviously, there's a couple of things here, right? I mean, let's just start. There's two things that stick out for me in this. One is maybe to 2022, 2023, in terms of getting the capacity to do these vaccines.
It's unacceptable.
Well, I mean, that's what he said. That's his claim. Let's just, now, May is a very wiggly term. Maybe it will take a year or two to get there. Let's just stipulate that it would. Let's just say that if you did do the waiver for the TRIPS, which is basically you're just doing a temporary waiver on IP, and that was, presented to the World Trade Organization. South Africa and India proposed this. And maybe they don't have a clue as to what they're doing and that they wouldn't get it till later. But even if I stipulate that, here's the thing. Fauci here is lying. He's not agnostic, because you can tell in this sort of game that he's setting up here. This is not an either or situation. You can do both things. You can send supplies of vaccines there now and waive the patents and the IP so that these countries can develop their own capacity to do vaccines, because we already know that the idea of booster shots a year out in 2022, in 2023 are already being talked about. So this is not an either or thing. And when you set it up like that, like he is, as if the waivers on one hand are actually could end up being an obstacle to vaccinations getting there, you're giving away the game. You're not agnostic. You're actually saying, I think we should protect these IP things.
He is conflating transferring technology with waiving patents, which is like not accurate, basically. I mean, waiving patents essentially says, okay, the Moderna, Pfizer, they can't sue, basically. I mean, that's all the waiving of the patents does. There can be multiple ways to get vaccines to these countries. This is purely about Biden protecting big pharma. That's really what this is.
Yes, and I even if I want to be generous with him and say, and charitable, and say, when he says transfer the technology, what he's talking about is also transmitting and open sourcing the mechanisms that are necessary to produce the vaccine, right?
As if though India, for example, as we've said repeatedly, doesn't have the capacity. I mean,
but I'm not talking about the physical capacity.
Okay.
There are, in the development of these vaccines, in the production of these vaccines, the process itself, not just the materials within it, but the process itself is also patented. And so I'm being generous here. I don't know. I don't know the answer. I know that, the transfer of technology could be a term of art, as it were, that suggests the giving of the intellectual property involved in the production of the vaccines. But even if we stipulate that what he's saying is true, that it would take, whatever he's referring to, would take a year or more to develop there will be a need there. I mean, make no doubt about it, right? Like,
then get started now.
Exactly. Do that. You can do both, is my point.
Because how do we know it's not still going to be a problem a year or 2 years from now?
Of course it will be. We already know it will be a problem a year or two now, because, I mean, look at where we are in this country with the fastest rollout, right? We're still at like 50%, if there. And we're talking about 70% of adults by July 4th. That's, now we're 7 months out from the first the deployment of the vaccine, right? We're 8-9 months out from the production of it. Like, there's just no way there's not going to be a need for vaccines in 2022 and 2023. And that's assuming that even if we're talking about first shot for people, never mind boosters, there is nothing that prevents us from doing both.
And what is he claiming about the technology being shared and how that's going to take multiple years for 2022 to 2023? I mean, that seems like or not the technology. Now I'm doing the conflating. Like, what was he trying to say there?
He was trying to say that, look, it's going to take a certain amount of time for the introduction of these specific technologies being not just a question of machinery, but also know-how, specific to this vaccine, to be adopted in probably the furthermost regions and least, and maybe that's true or maybe it isn't. I suspect that he's exaggerating it. He's saying May.
Yes.
That's what the May is. But again, it doesn't matter if he's exaggerating it. Even if we accept that premise as definitive, not May, but definitive, there's still a real problem, because the bottom line is that they're going to need vaccines then. And pursuing that avenue in no way inhibits the ability to send vaccines. So, I mean, it's really disingenuous. And I think it turns out maybe not so agnostic.
It's about maintaining underdevelopment in countries that aren't Western.
Yeah. Well, that's the other thing, is that people should understand this too. Once this stuff is set up, I think this is what they're really afraid of. Once this stuff is set up, once you build these factories and you build this capacity there, then the pressure to release future intellectual property in situations like this, and in maybe not as dire situations, built, right? Because then you don't have that excuse. Then you can't go on and say, I'm agnostic about this, because it could take 3 years before we're ready for that. And it's like, oh, wait a second. Actually, it turns out, no, it'd take 3 months.
It's the same argument that we were having about that $200 billion when it comes to, more ACA subsidies or expand Medicare.
Absolutely.
You crack the door a little and people go, wow, this is possible? Big Pharma doesn't have a complete hold over all the intellectual property of life-saving drugs and vaccines, and they could be mass-produced in other countries that are demeaned and talked down to as if they don't have the capacity to do this themselves. Wow.
This is the same story that we used to hear, like, why can't we import drugs from Canada? You just can't. You can't trust. I mean, Canada.
Can't trust them.
You can't trust it. You have no idea what kind of stuff they're getting in Canada. I mean, These people, like, they...
Who would make that argument? Because that was an argument deployed against Bernie Sanders in, the 2016 primary? This was a pet project of his?
Yeah, 10, 15 years ago. Wow. It was... Back then, Canada was, like, very backwards.
Shady, yeah.
Just to put a finer point on it, too, I mean, like, not setting these things up, these production facilities in the world, is a part of, soft power and global hegemony of the U.S. in a way that we don't need to flex, our military might. This is just a way for us to continue to dominate the global South.
Yes.